My mother proudly raised her glass at her 30th wedding anniversary gala to toast my sister's 4-month pregnancy. She called it the very first grandchild and the heir to our family legacy. Then she pointed the microphone directly at me in front of 200 elite guests and asked when my turn would be. I calmly replied that my turn was 11 months ago. I told her she was actually invited, but her golden daughter hid the baby from her. Before I share how this single moment brought their fake high society empire crashing down around them, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to stand your ground against toxic family members who constantly underestimated you. I am Kiara, and I am 35 years old. Growing up in Buckhead, Atlanta, my family was completely obsessed with image. My parents, Beatrice and Clarence, cared more about their country club memberships and social standing than they ever cared about me. I was always the scapegoat, the rebellious daughter who never fit their perfect mold. My younger sister, Ebony, was the exact opposite. She was 33 years old and treated like absolute royalty. She was their golden child, a public relations director who spent her entire life curating a fake reality for social media. When she married Trent, a 35-year-old white financial guy who claimed to manage a massive hedge fund, my parents treated him like a trophy. To them, Trent represented the ultimate level of arrival in their elite circles. They bragged about him to anyone who would listen, constantly praising his imaginary wealth while deliberately ignoring his obvious flaws. Meanwhile, they treated my husband, Malik, and me like we were invisible. Malik is a brilliant neurosurgeon, and I run a venture capital firm that manages hundreds of millions of dollars. We built a beautiful life together based on actual hard work, rather than just appearances. But to my parents, I was just playing boss at a little startup. They shoved us at a terrible table near the swinging kitchen doors for their grand anniversary gala at the Ritz-Carlton. The gorgeous ballroom was completely dripping in new money extravagance. The tables were decorated with towering crystal centerpieces and white orchids. 200 of Atlanta's most influential Black elite were seated around the room. Beatrice tapped a silver spoon against her crystal champagne flute. She stood at the center of the head table, wearing a ridiculous sequined gown that caught every light in the room. She commanded the attention of the entire ballroom with a wide, manufactured smile. "We have gathered tonight to celebrate 30 years of marriage," she began, her voice echoing through the sound system. "But Clarence and I have an even greater blessing to share with all of you tonight. Our beautiful daughter Ebony is 4 months pregnant." She paused, allowing a wave of polite applause to wash over the room. Ebony placed a hand over her perfectly flat stomach and beamed at the crowd, while Trent wrapped an arm around her shoulder, looking incredibly smug. "This will be the very first grandchild of the Washington family," Beatrice announced proudly. "The heir to our legacy." I sat at my table by the kitchen doors, feeling Malik reach under the tablecloth to gently squeeze my hand. He knew exactly what was coming next. Beatrice turned her body slightly and sought me out in the dim lighting. The spotlight physically shifted, hitting our table and momentarily blinding me. Beatrice gripped the microphone tighter. Her voice dripped with fake sympathy and sharp venom. "Kiara, sweetheart," she called out across the massive room. "Are you planning to wait until menopause to give us a grandchild? Or did playing boss at your little startup make you forget how to be a real woman?" A collective gasp rippled through the distinguished crowd. Several guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, looking away out of secondhand embarrassment. At the head table, Trent threw his head back and snickered loudly. His harsh laughter cut through the sudden heavy silence of the ballroom. Ebony offered a pitiful pout, pretending to feel sorry for me while clearly basking in the attention. For 33 years, I had swallowed these public humiliations. I had kept my mouth shut to keep the peace. I had allowed my mother to use my life as a punchline to elevate my sister. But I was no longer that scared little girl seeking their validation. I did not flinch. I calmly wiped my mouth with my linen napkin and stood up from my chair. I caught the eye of a passing waiter and smoothly took the wireless microphone from his tray. The microphone hummed as I switched it on. My voice was steady and perfectly clear as it echoed through the ballroom. 11 months ago, I said, staring directly into my mother's eyes. That is when my turn was. The entire room went completely dead silent. You could have heard a pin drop on the thick carpet. I took a slow step forward. You were invited to the baby shower and the hospital mother. True story. But your golden daughter hid my baby from you. She intercepted the invitations and threw them in the trash. Beatrice's jaw dropped. The color completely drained from her face. She shrieked into her own microphone, her voice shrill and panicked. You are a jealous liar, Kiara. Ebony told us you moved abroad a year ago to run away from your failing business. Trent immediately stood up and pointed an aggressive finger at me across the room. Nice fiction, Kiara, he sneered loudly. But who would ever be jealous of a miserable paycheck-to-paycheck spinster like you? You are really nothing but a pathetic failure, desperately trying to ruin this beautiful celebration for your sister because you have absolutely nothing going on in your own lonely, empty life. Malik, my husband of 5 years, did not raise his voice or match their chaotic energy. He simply reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out his phone, and tapped the screen twice. Above the head table, where my mother and sister were still standing like deer caught in headlights, the massive projector screens, ordinarily used for anniversary slideshows, began to slowly descend. The room fell silent except for the mechanical hum of the screens. Malik had smoothly connected his device to the ballroom's audio-visual system, a skill he perfected during countless medical conferences. The screens flickered to life, displaying sharp, high-definition security footage. The timestamp in the corner read exactly 11 months ago. It was my parents' own front porch in Buckhead. The familiar, imposing double doors framed by perfectly manicured topiaries. A courier in a neat uniform walked up the steps, carrying an exquisite pale green gift box wrapped in a wide satin ribbon. He placed it carefully on the welcome mat and left. The box contained my birth announcement and a solid gold baby bracelet engraved with Leo's name, a family tradition my mother had always obsessed over. The footage sped up slightly. 10 minutes later, my sister Ebony appeared on screen. She was wearing her designer workout gear, fresh from Pilates. She walked up the steps, spotted the pale green box, and paused. She looked around, making sure no one was watching, then quickly snatched the box and retreated to the side of the porch near the recycling bins. The entire ballroom of 200 guests watched in absolute silence as the footage captured Ebony ripping the beautiful satin ribbon off the box. She tore into the packaging, pulling out the custom-printed birth announcement. Even on the security footage, you could see her face contort with an ugly mix of rage and jealousy. She crumpled the thick, expensive cardstock into a tight ball. But she did not stop there. She dug deeper into the box and pulled out the small velvet case. She opened it, examining the solid gold bracelet that was meant to be my son's first family heirloom. Without a second thought, she slipped the velvet case into her designer gym bag. Then she shoved the crumpled birth announcement and the ruined gift box deep into the recycling bin, piling old newspapers on top to hide the evidence. The video ended freezing on the final frame of Ebony walking casually into the house, her gym bag slightly heavier. A collective gasp rippled through the distinguished crowd. Murmurs erupted across the tables. Several older women in the front row audibly whispered their shock. I watched Trent's smug smile melt off his face, replaced by a look of sheer panic as he realized his wife was not the innocent victim she always claimed to be. Ebony turned ghost pale. She clutched the edge of the head table, her knuckles white, opening her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. The golden child was entirely exposed, her perfect public image shattered in less than 60 seconds. I looked at my mother, waiting for the inevitable moment of realization. Waiting for Beatrice to finally see her golden daughter for the manipulative thief she truly was. But I had underestimated the depth of my mother's toxic favoritism. Beatrice did not turn her rage on Ebony. She did not demand an explanation for the stolen gold bracelet or the discarded birth announcement. Instead, she hiked up her sequined gown and marched directly past the head table, her heels clicking aggressively on the hardwood floor until she reached my table by the kitchen doors. Her face was a mask of pure indignation. "Why didn't you just call me?" she hissed, her voice a harsh whisper that still somehow carried to the nearest tables. You know Ebony has been struggling with infertility for years, Kiara. Sending a flashy birth announcement to the house was a direct attack on your sister. You knew she would see it. You did this just to hurt her. I stared at her, completely stunned by the mental gymnastics she was performing. My sister had just been caught on video stealing from her own nephew and hiding his existence from our family, and my mother was blaming me for not being sensitive enough to her feelings. You are defending her, I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. She stole your grandson's birth announcement, Mother. Beatrice waved her hand dismissively, ignoring my words entirely. Ebony was emotional. She was in pain. And now you have humiliated her in front of all these important people. She jabbed a manicured finger toward my chest. You need to fix this right now, Kiara. You are going to stand up there and apologize to your sister. And then you are going to pay for her entire baby shower to make up for this embarrassment. I looked from my mother's furious face to Ebony, who was now dabbing at her dry eyes, pretending to be overwhelmed by the situation, playing the victim, just as she always did. Trent was glaring at me, trying to regain his posture of superiority. I took a deep breath, feeling a strange sense of liberation wash over me. The last remaining thread of hope I had for this family finally snapped. I calmly reached down and picked up my clutch. I opened it, snapping the clasp with a sharp, defining sound. Pay for her shower, I asked, my voice echoing clearly without the need for a microphone. Mother, I have already paid $90,000 for her to get pregnant. I let those words hang in the heavy air of the ballroom. The absolute silence that followed was deafening. Beatrice stared at me, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, unable to process what I had just said. Ebony took a physical step back, bumping into the edge of the head table. I slowly unzipped my designer clutch and pulled out a thick, folded piece of paper. It was printed on the heavy cream cardstock of the most exclusive fertility clinic in Atlanta. I walked over to my mother's table and slapped the invoice down right next to her half-empty crystal champagne flute. Take a good look, Mother, I said, my voice projecting perfectly across the silent room. It is an itemized receipt from Dr. Arrington's clinic. 4 rounds of in vitro fertilization, along with specialized hormone treatments and concierge medical care. You remember when Ebony was crying for months because insurance would not cover the procedures? You remember when she miraculously received that anonymous charity grant for struggling families? That was not a charity. That was my venture capital firm. I personally approved the quiet transfer of $90,000 so my sister could have the child she was desperately crying for. Beatrice looked down at the paper, her eyes scanning the official letterhead and my digital signature at the bottom of the billing statement. Her hands began to tremble as the reality of the document set in. This makes no sense, she stammered, looking frantically from the paper to Trent. Trent manages a hedge fund. He makes millions. Why would they need a charity grant? I turned my gaze to Trent, who was suddenly sweating through his custom-tailored tuxedo. Because your perfect upper-crust white son-in-law went completely bankrupt 2 years ago, I announced to the room. He does not manage a hedge fund. He lost his investors' money in a series of terrible crypto bets and leveraged his own assets until the banks froze his accounts. He has been riding on fumes and credit card debt while you parade him around the country club like he is the Wolf of Wall Street. He could not even afford the copay for an ultrasound, let alone $90,000 for fertility treatments. A collective gasp rippled through the 200 guests. The whispers began immediately, a low buzzing sound that filled the ballroom as Atlanta's black elite leaned in to gossip. Cell phones were discreetly pulled out to text the scandal to people who had missed the gala. Waiters froze in their tracks, holding silver trays of expensive champagne, afraid to make a single sound. I watched the golden couple crumble. Ebony buried her face in her hands, sobbing loudly, but this time the tears were absolutely real. She was weeping for her destroyed social status and the end of her carefully curated illusion. Trent, on the other hand, did not cry. The humiliation of being exposed in front of an entire room of wealthy, successful Black professionals stripped away his carefully crafted savior facade. His face turned a dangerous shade of beet red. The veins in his neck bulged against his tight silk collar. For years, he had walked through our family gatherings with an air of smug superiority, subtly making it known that his presence elevated our family. Now he was nothing but a broke fraud standing in a borrowed tuxedo. "Shut your mouth, you jealous, psychotic liar!" Trent roared, his voice cracking as he lunged forward. He slammed his fists onto the head table, sending expensive silverware and crystal clattering to the floor. "You think you are so smart with your little spreadsheets? You are nothing. You and your husband are just a couple of ghetto, classless upstarts trying to tear down people who actually belong in high society." The ballroom gasped again at the word ghetto. The racial microaggression hung in the air, thick, offensive, and undeniable. "Clarence." My father finally stood up from his chair, looking appalled, but he was too weak to actually intervene. My mother just stood there, paralyzed by the social disaster unfolding at her anniversary party. Trent was completely losing his mind, pacing back and forth behind the head table, pointing frantically at Malik and me. "You people always want to drag successful people down to your level," Trent shouted, spit flying from his lips. "You think paying a medical bill makes you better than me? I am Trent Sterling. I am a rainmaker. I provide for my wife. In fact, I just closed a massive real estate deal last month and bought Ebony a $4 million mansion in Buckhead. It has 8 bedrooms and a private tennis court. We are building a life of true luxury while you sit at the back table seething with jealousy. You could never afford a home like ours in your wildest dreams." Trent stood tall, his chest puffed out desperately, trying to use his imaginary real estate to glue his shattered dignity back together. He looked around the room, expecting the guests to be impressed by the $4 million price tag. Instead, they just stared at him in uncomfortable silence, waiting to see what would happen next. Malik, who had been standing quietly by my side this entire time, did not raise his voice. He did not match Trent's erratic screaming. He took one step forward, exuding the kind of calm, effortless power that Trent could only pretend to have. Malik buttoned his suit jacket, smiling coldly. "A $4 million mansion in Buckhead. You mean the one owned by Apex Holdings?" Trent's face froze. The aggressive, puffed-out posture he had just assumed completely deflated. He blinked rapidly, clearly struggling to comprehend what Malik had just said. "What are you talking about?" Trent stammered, his voice losing all of its previous booming authority. "Apex Holdings is a massive private real estate conglomerate. You do not know anything about them." Malik took another leisurely step forward, closing the distance between them. "I know everything about them, Trent," Malik said, his voice smooth and incredibly calm. "Because 6 months ago, my wife's venture capital firm acquired a 70% controlling stake in Apex Holdings. We own the portfolio, which means, Trent, we own that beautiful 8-bedroom mansion in Buckhead." I watched as the blood completely drained from Trent's pale face. He looked like a man who had just stepped off a cliff and was waiting for gravity to take hold. "You did not buy anything," I added, stepping up to stand shoulder to shoulder with my husband. "You signed a residential lease agreement, a lease that you have defaulted on for the past 5 months. Ebony grabbed Trent's arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his cheap rented tuxedo jacket. "Trent, what are they talking about?" she whispered frantically, her eyes darting around the room. "Tell them they are lying. Tell them we own the house." Trent could not even look at his wife. He kept his eyes fixed on the floor, his mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. The silence in the ballroom was deafening, broken only by the soft clicks and camera shutters of smartphones. The elite guests, the very people Beatrice and Ebony had spent years trying to impress, were now eagerly recording the spectacular downfall of the Washington family golden couple. I could see the society women at the front tables whispering behind their hands, their eyes wide with hungry fascination. I reviewed the property management reports yesterday. I continued, making sure my voice carried clear to the back of the room. "The legal team sent multiple warnings to your email and your physical address. You ignored all of them. So at 4 o'clock this afternoon, a formal eviction notice was taped to your wrought iron gate. You and Ebony have exactly 3 days to vacate my property." Beatrice let out a strangled cry. She pushed her way past the head table, her heavy sequined gown catching on a dining chair, but she did not care. This is a trick, she yelled, pointing a shaking finger at me. Clarence, do something. Tell this ungrateful girl to stop telling these horrible lies about our son-in-law. She is just trying to ruin her sister's special night because she is bitter. My father, Clarence, had been standing frozen near the mahogany bar cart. He was a man who prided himself on absolute control, on maintaining the strict image of a powerful patriarch. He walked over slowly, holding a heavy crystal glass filled with amber scotch. He looked at me with deep, profound disappointment, the exact same look he had given me my entire life whenever I failed to conform to his rigid expectations. Kiara, this is enough, Clarence said, his voice trembling with suppressed rage. You have made your point. You have money now. Congratulations. But you will not stand here and accuse Trent of being a deadbeat. He is a successful hedge fund manager. He handles millions of dollars for the most elite clients in this city. You are making a fool of yourself. I looked at my father, feeling a strange mix of pity and absolute disgust. Dad, he does not manage anything, I said softly, stripping away the last remaining layer of the illusion. He lost his firm's backing 2 years ago. His trading licenses are suspended, the luxury cars are leased and past due. The designer bags Ebony flaunts on social media are bought on credit cards that are currently sitting in collections. They are completely broke. They have been funding this fake lifestyle with lies. Clarence stopped walking. He stood about 5 feet away from Trent. The confident patriarch facade began to literally crumble before my eyes. He looked at Trent. Really looked at him perhaps for the first time, without the blinding filter of white worship and country club prestige. He saw the sweat dripping down Trent's forehead. He saw the panicked, guilty look in his eyes. Trent Clarence said, his voice suddenly sounding very old and very fragile. Is this true? Are you being evicted? Trent swallowed hard. His Adam's apple bobbed nervously as he looked around the room like a trapped animal searching for an exit. Clarence, sir, it is just a temporary cash flow issue, Trent stammered, raising his hands defensively. The market has been incredibly volatile lately. I have capital tied up in offshore investments. I just need a few weeks to liquidate some assets and I can catch up on the rent. I swear to you the money is coming. The heavy crystal glass slipped from my father's hand. It hit the hardwood floor with a sharp, violent crash, sending shards of glass and expensive scotch flying across the polished wood. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the quiet room. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Clarence lunged forward with a speed and ferocity I had never seen from him. He grabbed Trent by the collar of his tuxedo, twisting the fabric so tightly that Trent let out a choking gasp. You are facing eviction! Clarence roared, his voice tearing through the silent ballroom with raw terror. Then where the hell is the $500,000 from my retirement fund that I wired to your hedge fund last week? Trent stumbled backward, his face draining of all color until he looked pale and sickly under the ballroom lights. He raised his hands in a frantic, pacifying gesture, but his voice was shaking so badly he could barely form a coherent sentence. Clarence, wait, he stammered, backing away as my father advanced on him. You do not understand. The market is just the liquidity is tied up right now in a massive short position. I can get it back. I just need a little more time to move some assets. I did not let him finish that pathetic excuse. I signaled Malik, who smoothly tapped his tablet again. The massive projector screens behind the head table shifted from the security footage to a dizzying array of complex financial documents. Bank statements, wire transfer logs, and heavily redacted SEC filings illuminated the ballroom. The crowd of elite guests leaned in collectively, their eyes glued to the screens. As I stepped forward, my voice cutting through Trent's desperate lies. There is no short position. Trent, I announced, projecting my voice so every single person in the room could hear the absolute truth. There are no offshore assets. There is no hedge fund. It is a textbook Ponzi scheme. My father stopped dead in his tracks, his fists clenching at his sides. He stared at the screens, his chest heaving, as the reality of his stolen retirement fund began to sink in. Beatrice let out a low, horrified gasp, clapping a hand over her mouth. I turned back to Trent, my gaze completely merciless. Through rapid-fire, legally accurate dialogue, I broke down exactly how his fake empire operated. You took my father's $500,000 and you did not invest a single dime of it. I explained, pointing to the highlighted bank statements on the screen. The very next morning, you wired $80,000 to a luxury car dealership to cover the lease on Ebony's new Porsche. 2 days later, you dropped another $40,000 at Hermes to buy those Birkin bags she constantly flaunts on Instagram. You used the rest to pay off angry investors from your last failed venture just to keep them from going to the authorities. You are not a rainmaker, Trent. You are a common thief running a low-rent pyramid scheme to fund a fake lifestyle. The ballroom erupted. The whispers turned into outright exclamations of shock and disgust. The black elite of Atlanta, the people my parents had spent their entire lives trying to impress, were now staring at Trent and Ebony like they were common criminals. Women were practically vibrating with scandalized glee, rapidly texting the details to anyone who was not lucky enough to be at the gala. Men in expensive suits shook their heads in disbelief, realizing the golden couple they had admired were nothing but broke fraudsters. Ebony realized the game was over. The perfect, flawless life she had spent years carefully curating was burning to the ground right in front of her eyes. She resorted to her oldest, most effective defense mechanism. She threw herself into her role as the ultimate victim. She let out a piercing theatrical wail and collapsed against our mother, clinging to Beatrice's sequined gown like a terrified child. "Mom," she sobbed hysterically, her fake eyelashes fluttering as tears streamed down her face. "I did not know. I swear I did not know anything about this. Trent lied to me. He told me his business was booming. He told me the cars and the bags were gifts because he was so successful. I had no idea he was stealing from Dad. I am a victim here too. He manipulated me." Beatrice immediately wrapped her arms around Ebony, her protective instincts kicking in right on cue. She glared at Trent with pure venom, her eyes flashing with a mix of betrayal and absolute rage. "You monster," Beatrice hissed, pulling Ebony closer. "You lied to my daughter. You used her. You manipulated our family and stole from my husband. I will see you rot in a federal prison for what you have done to my baby girl." Trent looked wildly between Beatrice and Ebony, his mouth opening and closing in complete shock. He had expected Ebony to stand by him to maintain a united front. Instead, she was throwing him under the bus without a second's hesitation, desperate to save her own social standing. But I was not about to let Ebony play the innocent victim. I had spent my entire life watching her manipulate our parents, watching her twist every situation to make herself look like a saint while I took the blame. Not tonight. I reached into my designer clutch and pulled out a single neatly folded piece of paper. It was a certified wire transfer authorization log obtained directly from the bank during the acquisition of Apex Holdings. I let out a short, sharp laugh that cut right through Ebony's theatrical sobbing. "Oh, really, Ebony?" I asked, my voice dripping with cold, sarcastic amusement. "You are just a poor, innocent victim who had absolutely no idea where the money was coming from. You thought it was all just a happy coincidence." I unfolded the document and held it up for my parents to see while Malik simultaneously projected the digital copy onto the massive screens behind me. The authorization log was highlighted in bright yellow, displaying the details of a $500,000 transfer to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. "Then whose digital signature is this, Ebony?" Ebony stared at the massive screen, her mouth hanging open in silent horror. The bright yellow highlighted box displayed a perfect digital rendering of her loopy, elegant signature right next to Trent's. I did not give her a single second to invent another lie or play the victim. I stepped closer to the head table, my voice echoing through the silent ballroom with the precision of a prosecutor delivering a closing argument. I read the authorization log aloud, making sure every single person in the room understood the absolute depth of her betrayal. Transfer authorization for $500,000 from the primary retirement account of Clarence Washington to the Sterling Global offshore entity in the Cayman Islands. Authorized by Trent Sterling and co-signed by Ebony Washington Sterling on October 12th. "You knew exactly what he was doing, Ebony," I said, my voice laced with cold, absolute disgust. "You were not just some innocent little housewife sitting at the country club sipping mimosas while your husband made bad trades. When the bank started closing in, and the creditors started calling you, actively helped him hide the money, you helped him steal from our own father to keep up your charade. Ebony shook her head frantically, stepping back until she hit the wall behind the head table. No, she whimpered, her hands trembling as she looked at the judging faces of the crowd. He told me it was just a temporary holding account. He said it was for tax purposes to protect our assets. He made me sign those papers, Kiara. I did not know what they were for. I laughed, a harsh, bitter sound that echoed off the crystal chandeliers. Tax purposes for a man who has not reported a positive income in 2 years. Do not play dumb, Ebony. You signed that transfer the exact same day you purchased your second Platinum Country Club membership. You signed it 3 days before you hosted that lavish charity brunch that you quietly charged to Dad's credit card. You knew Trent was completely bankrupt and you chose to drain our parents' entire life savings just to keep up your fake Instagram lifestyle. You would rather let our own parents starve in their old age than lose your country club membership and admit to these people that your perfect life was a complete lie. The ballroom was so quiet, you could hear the mechanical hum of the projector. The elite guests, Atlanta's most prominent doctors, lawyers, and socialites, were no longer just whispering. They were staring at Ebony with open, unapologetic contempt. The golden child, the perfect daughter who had spent her entire life looking down on everyone else, was finally exposed as a greedy, calculating fraud. Several women in the front row, who Ebony had desperately tried to impress for years, were actively turning their backs on her. Clarence looked like he had aged 20 years in the span of 5 minutes. He stared at Ebony, his chest heaving, his hands shaking uncontrollably at his sides. My father, the man who had always placed Ebony on a pedestal, who had always told me I needed to be more like my perfect sister, looked completely shattered. You stole my retirement, Clarence whispered, his voice cracking with a pain that was hard to witness. I worked for 40 years to build that fund, and you stole everything I worked for. Ebony burst into loud, theatrical tears, completely abandoning her dignified poise. She reached out for our father, but he instinctively recoiled, taking a step away from her. She then turned and collapsed against our mother, clinging to Beatrice's sequined anniversary gown like a terrified child. Mom, she wailed, burying her face in Beatrice's shoulder. I am a victim here too. Trent manipulated me. He used my signature. I had no idea where the money came from, I swear it. But before Ebony could continue her performance, Beatrice snapped out of her paralyzed shock. My mother did not turn her rage toward the daughter who had just stolen $500,000. She did not comfort her husband who had just lost his life savings. Instead, Beatrice was entirely consumed by the fact that her flawless family image was being destroyed in front of Atlanta's high society. She could not process the betrayal, only the public embarrassment. Beatrice hiked up her heavy sequined gown and marched directly toward me, her heels striking the hardwood floor with aggressive purpose. Her face was twisted into a mask of pure, desperate panic. She reached out and grabbed my arm, her manicured fingernails digging painfully into my skin. Kiara, stop this right now, Beatrice hissed, her voice a harsh, frantic whisper that still managed to carry across the quiet room. You are embarrassing us. You are ruining my anniversary gala. People are recording this on their phones. You need to shut down that projector immediately. I looked at my mother's hand digging into my arm and then looked up at her panicked face. You are worried about being embarrassed, I asked, my voice dangerously calm. Your golden daughter and her fraud husband just stole $500,000 from Dad, and you are worried about the gala. Beatrice ignored my words entirely. Her eyes darted wildly around the room, taking in the guests who were watching our family implode. You are a millionaire, Kiara, Beatrice demanded, her grip tightening on my arm as she pulled me closer. You and Malik have millions of dollars in that venture capital firm. You bought their stupid landlord company, so I know you have the cash liquid. I stared at her, completely stunned by the sheer audacity of her logic. I could see the gears turning in her head, desperately trying to find a way to sweep this massive scandal under the rug to maintain the flawless Washington family facade at any cost. You have to cover that $500,000 right now, Kiara, my mother ordered, her voice turning harsh and commanding. expecting immediate obedience just like always. You are going to transfer that money to your father's account tonight. We will tell everyone this was just a misunderstanding, a silly administrative error with the banks. You are going to fix this so nobody finds out the truth about Trent and Ebony. We cannot let these people think we are broken. I stood there paralyzed by the toxic weight of her demand. My sister had committed grand larceny and fraud against our own parents, and my mother was demanding that I pay the bill just to save face. It was the ultimate black tax. The expectation that the successful child, the one who was always pushed aside, must bleed themselves dry to cover the monumental mistakes of the golden child, all in the name of family loyalty and keeping up appearances. We are family, Kiara. Beatrice continued, her voice growing louder, more desperate as she shook my arm. We take care of our own. You have the money to make this go away and protect your sister. You owe us for raising you. You owe this family your loyalty. The guests watched in stunned fascination, waiting to see if the scapegoat daughter would fold under the pressure of the matriarch's absolute command. For a moment, the entire room held its breath. I looked at Trent, who was sweating and trembling, trying to hide behind a chair. I looked at Ebony, who was peering out from behind our mother, still pretending to cry. I looked at Clarence, who was staring at the floor, too broken and humiliated to even speak up to defend himself. And finally, I looked at Beatrice, the woman who had spent my entire life telling me I was never good enough. I felt a profound sense of absolute clarity wash over me. The invisible chains of obligation and toxic guilt that had bound me to this family for 35 years simply dissolved into nothing. I did not feel angry anymore. I did not feel sad. I just felt completely free from their madness. I slowly reached over and removed my mother's hand from my arm, prying her fingers off my skin, one by one, with deliberate, terrifying calmness. I let her hand drop to her side and took a step back, putting physical distance between us for the final time. I owe you, I asked, my voice ringing out with crystal-clear precision, echoing across the silent ballroom. Let us talk about what I owe you. Let us talk about what I owe you. The words floated through the heavy air of the ballroom, carrying the weight of 35 years of pain and betrayal. Beatrice stood frozen, her arms falling limply to her sides. I looked at the woman who was supposed to protect me, who was supposed to nurture me, and I felt nothing but cold, absolute clarity. You want to talk about debts, Mother, I said, taking another step back so the entire room could clearly see the physical and emotional space between us. Let us go back 17 years to the exact day I turned 18. I remember it perfectly because while Ebony was getting ready for her lavish debutante ball surrounded by makeup artists and tailors, I was sitting in a plastic chair at the local bank branch, crying my eyes out until I could barely breathe. I paused, letting the memory settle over the room. My voice was completely steady, without a single tremor of the anxiety that used to choke me whenever I stood up to them. I had walked into that bank to withdraw the first installment of my college tuition. I continued my gaze, sweeping past Beatrice, to lock onto my father, who was now sweating profusely. The teller looked at me with such profound pity when she handed me the account printout. The account was empty. Every single dollar of the college fund that was supposed to be mine, the money I had been promised my entire life, was completely gone. The balance was exactly zero. Beatrice opened her mouth to speak, to formulate another lie, but I did not let her. I raised my hand, silencing her instantly. You and Dad emptied it, I said, projecting my voice so the society matrons in the back row could hear every single devastating word. You drained $75,000 of my future in one afternoon. And do you want to know what you bought with my education? You bought Ebony a brand new, fully loaded silver Mercedes-Benz because she could not possibly be seen driving a used car to her prestigious sorority rush events. You took my tuition to fund her designer rush wardrobe, her luxury campus apartment, and her ridiculous campaign to become president of a social club. Ebony looked away, staring at the floor as the whispers erupted around us again. I watched my father's jaw clench, but I was just getting started. When I confronted you both about it, you told me I was being selfish. I said, laughing, a dry, hollow sound that made several guests shift uncomfortably in their seats. You told me Ebony needed to make the right connections to secure her future and that I was smart enough to figure it out on my own. You told me to go to the financial aid office and take out loans like normal people do. So that is exactly what I did. I took out massive predatory student loans that kept me awake at night, suffocating under the crushing weight of the debt. I worked 3 different jobs just to keep a leaking roof over my head, I told the silent crowd. I waited tables at a diner until 2 in the morning. I scrubbed campus dormitories on the weekends until my hands bled. I did mind-numbing data entry between classes just to afford textbooks. I survived on cheap ramen noodles and tap water while my sister drove my college fund around Buckhead going to bottomless brunches. And when the sheer physical exhaustion finally broke me when I had to drop out for a semester just to save enough money to eat what did you call me, I took a slow, deliberate step toward my parents, my eyes burning into theirs. You called me a struggling dropout, I said, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper that still somehow carried through the microphone Malik had discreetly turned on at the head table. You paraded Ebony around at these fancy country club dinners, bragging about her perfect sorority life, while you told all your wealthy friends I was just going through a troubled phase. You used my exhaustion to highlight her fake perfection. You used my poverty to make yourselves look like patient, suffering parents dealing with a difficult, ungrateful child. You deliberately stripped me of my dignity so you could polish her golden crown. Beatrice was shaking her head, her carefully styled hair falling out of place, her diamond earrings trembling. We gave you life, she stammered desperately, trying to reclaim her matriarchal authority in front of her peers. We put a roof over your head when you were a child. You cannot speak to us this way in front of our friends. You owe us for everything you have. You owe this family your absolute loyalty. I do not owe you a single breath, I replied, stepping directly into her space and forcing her to look into my eyes. I built my empire with the dirt you threw at me. Every single dollar Malik and I made, we made because we knew nobody was ever coming to save us. We built our venture capital firm from the ground up while you were busy writing checks to cover Ebony's endless lies. I paid for her fertility treatments because I actually loved my sister and wanted her to be happy despite everything she took from me. But I will absolutely not pay $500,000 to save you from the consequences of your own toxic favoritism. I do not owe you a dime. Clarence could not take it anymore. The public dismantling of his patriarch image, the exposure of his absolute financial negligence, and the utter defiance of his scapegoat daughter was simply too much for his fragile ego to bear. His face turned a deep mottled purple. He stepped in front of Beatrice, puffing out his chest and pointing a shaking finger directly at my face. You insolent little brat! Clarence roared, his voice booming across the ballroom, bouncing off the walls. I will not stand here and be disrespected by you in my own family. I am the head of this family. I am the one who commands respect here. You think your little internet business gives you the right to come in here and humiliate us? You are nothing but a bitter, jealous child who is trying to ruin a beautiful evening because you could never be like your sister. He turned away from me and frantically waved his hand toward the back of the ballroom, his eyes wild with desperation. Security, he bellowed, his voice cracking with rage. I want security in here right now. These two are trespassing. They are disturbing the peace and threatening my guests. I want them thrown out immediately. Escort them off the property, and if they resist, call the police and have them arrested. 2 uniformed security guards who had been hovering near the double doors immediately stiffened and began walking down the center aisle toward the head table. Clarence stood tall, adjusting his tuxedo jacket, trying to look like the powerful man in charge, handling a minor disruption. He looked around at the guests, nodding firmly, as if to say the situation was entirely under his control. He fully expected Malik and me to cower, to apologize, to run away in tears of embarrassment. Malik simply crossed his arms over his chest and smiled, shifting his weight casually as he watched the guards approach. I did not move a single inch. I stood my ground, holding my head high, feeling an overwhelming wave of peace wash over me. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the ballroom suddenly swung open with a loud thud that made several guests jump. The general manager of the exclusive country club walked in. He was a tall, severe-looking white man in a sharp gray suit holding a thick leather folio. He moved with urgent clipped steps, walking directly past the approaching security guards and making a beeline straight for the head table where Clarence was standing. Clarence smiled smugly, looking at the manager with an air of arrogant entitlement. "Ah, Richard, excellent timing," Clarence said, gesturing dismissively toward me and Malik. "Please have your men remove my daughter and her husband. They are no longer welcome at this anniversary gala. They have caused enough of a scene for one evening." The manager Richard did not even look at me. He did not signal the security guards to grab my arms or escort me out. Instead, he stopped directly in front of my father, planting his feet firmly on the hardwood floor. His expression was not the deferential, polite mask he usually wore for the wealthy country club members. It was tight, annoyed, and deeply unprofessional. "I am afraid I cannot do that, Mr. Washington," the manager said, his voice loud enough to carry over the silent crowd. "The security guards are not here for them." Clarence frowned, his smug smile faltering as confusion washed over his face. "What are you talking about?" Richard Clarence demanded. "I am a platinum member here. I am paying for this entire ballroom. I demand they be removed right this second." The manager opened his leather folio and pulled out a long, itemized receipt. He held it out toward my father, his eyes narrowing with barely concealed contempt. "Sir," the manager said, his tone completely devoid of any respect, "the credit card you used to secure this ballroom and the catering for tonight just declined. We tried running it 3 times, and the bank has placed a hard hold on your account due to insufficient funds. We need immediate payment in full for the $30,000 balance, or I am shutting down this event right now." Clarence looked as though the floor had suddenly dropped out from underneath him. All the color drained from his face, leaving him a sickly shade of ashen gray. He staggered backward, hitting the edge of the head table for support. His chest heaved as he struggled to pull air into his lungs, looking like a man who was about to faint right there on the polished hardwood floor. The whispers from the guests grew into a loud, chaotic murmur. The same people who had been drinking his expensive champagne and praising his business acumen all evening were now staring at him with a mix of shock and vicious delight. $30,000! Beatrice shrieked, stepping forward and glaring at the club manager. "Richard, that is absurd. We have been members of this club for 20 years. You know my husband is good for it. Run the card again." "I ran it 3 times, Mrs. Washington," Richard said, his voice flat and unyielding. "I also called the bank directly. The accounts are completely frozen. There is absolutely no money left. If you cannot provide an alternate form of payment right now, my staff will begin clearing the tables and asking your guests to leave." Beatrice turned to Clarence, her eyes wide with frantic disbelief. "Clarence, give him another card," she demanded. "Give him the corporate card from the manufacturing business. Tell him to run that one so we can get this over with and stop this humiliation." But Clarence did not reach for his wallet. He did not yell at the manager or demand to speak to the board of directors. He simply stood there looking like a deflated balloon, the weight of his massive deception finally crushing the last of his pride. He closed his eyes and let out a long, trembling breath. "There is no other card, Beatrice," he whispered, his voice so weak it barely carried over the noise of the ballroom. "The corporate accounts are gone too. Everything is gone." "What do you mean everything is gone?" Beatrice gasped, grabbing his arm and shaking him. "You own the largest manufacturing plant in the state. We have millions." Clarence finally opened his eyes, looking at the woman he had spent 4 decades trying to satisfy. "We had millions, Beatrice," he said, his voice cracking with the sheer weight of his failure. "But keeping you in designer gowns and funding Ebony's fake life cost more than the factory was bringing in. Do you know how much money I had to borrow just to keep up appearances? When Trent started losing his clients, I covered his margins so nobody in our social circle would know he was a failure. When you wanted to renovate the summer house for the 3rd time, I paid for it. I took out a second mortgage on the factory 2 years ago just to keep us afloat." The entire room gasped in unison. The great Clarence Washington, the man who had built a manufacturing empire and ruled our family with an iron fist, was standing in front of 200 people, admitting he was completely broke. I defaulted on the factory mortgage 3 months ago. Clarence confessed, tears finally welling in his eyes. The bank seized the commercial accounts last week. That is why I tried to wire the last of my personal retirement funds to Trent. He promised me he could double it in a month with an aggressive offshore investment. He promised he could save the business before the bank foreclosed on the property. Ebony let out a loud, dramatic wail, hiding her face against Trent's shoulder. But Trent just stared at the floor, looking entirely defeated. Beatrice looked like she might actually be physically sick. Her entire identity, her social standing, her pride was entirely wrapped up in the wealth Clarence provided. The realization that she was now effectively bankrupt was destroying her faster than any terminal illness ever could. But Clarence was not done. He wiped his face with a trembling hand and turned his gaze back to me. The sadness in his eyes vanished, replaced by that familiar, demanding glare. He straightened his posture desperately, trying to summon the paternal authority he had used to control me for my entire life. "You are going to fix this, Kiara," Clarence commanded, his voice growing louder, echoing through the silent room. "You are going to write a check and pay the club manager right now, and then tomorrow morning, you and your husband are going to call the bank. You have millions of dollars in that venture capital firm. You can pay off the second mortgage and get the factory out of default." I stared at him, letting his ridiculous demands wash over me without feeling a single ounce of obligation. "You have to save the factory, Kiara," he shouted, pointing his finger at my chest. "It is the family legacy. It is everything I built. You cannot let them take it away from us. You have a duty to this family to protect our name. You will buy that debt, and you will save my legacy." I calmly reached out and picked up a crystal flute of champagne from the nearest table. The glass felt cool and solid in my hand. I looked at my father, watching the desperate entitlement radiating from his sweating face. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the expensive champagne, letting the silence stretch out until the tension in the room was almost unbearable. "Do not worry, Dad," I said, my voice perfectly smooth and devoid of any emotion. "The bank already auctioned off your debt this morning, and I was the highest bidder. I own your legacy." Clarence stared at me, his mouth opening and closing, but no sound coming out. The realization that I was no longer his obedient scapegoat but the owner of his entire financial existence hit him like a physical blow. He looked back at the massive screen where the financial documents were still projected, and then back at me. His legs seemed to lose their strength, and he slumped heavily into the chair behind him, knocking over a crystal water glass in the process. The water spilled across the white linen tablecloth, dripping onto the floor with a steady, rhythmic sound that seemed deafening in the otherwise silent ballroom. Richard, the club manager, stood perfectly still, holding the declined credit card receipt like a weapon. He had seen countless wealthy families fall from grace, but the sheer magnitude of this public destruction clearly left him speechless. He did not move to intervene, he simply waited for his payment, knowing full well the Washington family was officially bankrupt. Beatrice was paralyzed. The woman who had dictated every aspect of our lives, who had curated the perfect Washington family image with ruthless precision, was completely out of her depth. She looked at Richard, who was still standing there waiting for his $30,000, and then she looked at the elite society women sitting at the front tables. Those women, the ones Beatrice had spent decades trying to impress, were now leaning toward each other, whispering behind their hands, their eyes wide with scandalous glee. "You bought the debt," Clarence whispered, his voice trembling so badly he sounded like a frightened child. "How could you possibly have that kind of money, Kiara? The factory was worth millions." "I bought it for pennies on the dollar, Dad," I said, my tone completely level. When a business is hemorrhaging money and defaulting on secondary mortgages, the bank just wants to cut its losses. Malik and I saw the auction listing 3 weeks ago. We used a subsidiary holding company to purchase the paper. You do not own the manufacturing plant anymore, Clarence. You do not own the machines, the inventory, or the land it sits on. I do. And tomorrow morning my lawyers are beginning the formal eviction process. Clarence let out a choked sob. The great patriarch, the man who had always demanded total submission, was crying in front of 200 people. His expensive tuxedo suddenly looked too big for him as his shoulders caved inward. He looked at Ebony, who was still hiding behind our mother, refusing to make eye contact with anyone. He finally saw her for what she really was: not a golden child, but a parasite who had drained his life savings and destroyed his legacy just to buy designer bags and lease luxury cars. The realization that he had sacrificed his own business to fund a lie broke the last remaining pieces of his spirit. "Please, Kiara." My father begged, his voice breaking as he looked up at me with pleading eyes. "You cannot do this. You cannot take the business. I built that factory from nothing. I worked my entire life to create a legacy for this family. It is all I have left. The retirement fund is gone. The credit cards are maxed out. If you take the factory, your mother and I will have nothing. We will lose the house. We will be out on the street." Beatrice finally snapped out of her stupor. The reality of losing her mansion, her status, and her wealth terrified her more than anything else. She stepped forward, holding her hands out toward me in a gesture of frantic supplication. "Kiara, sweetheart." Beatrice pleaded, forcing a trembling smile onto her face. "You have made your point. You are very successful, and we are very proud of you. But you have to sign the business back over to us. We are your parents. Family takes care of family. You have the money, you do not need the factory. Please, Kiara, you cannot let us lose everything. We will pay you back, we promise. Just sign the deed over to us, and we can put all this ugliness behind us." I looked at the two of them, watching them invoke the word family, as if it was a magic spell that would erase 35 years of abuse and neglect. They had never treated me like family. When I was working 3 jobs to pay for college, they called me a failure. When I got pregnant with Leo, they treated me like a disease. They kicked me out and told everyone I was a tragic mistake. And now, when they were completely bankrupt and humiliated, they suddenly remembered I was their daughter. I stood beside Malik, feeling his solid presence next to me. We had spent years working 70-hour weeks, taking calculated risks, and building a portfolio that gave us the kind of wealth my parents only pretended to have. We did it all for Leo, to ensure our son would never know the sting of conditional love or financial manipulation. "Family takes care of family," I repeated, letting the words hang in the air. "That is an interesting concept, Mother. Did family take care of me when you emptied my college fund to buy Ebony a car? Did family take care of me when you told me I was not welcome at Thanksgiving because my pregnancy would ruin your perfect family photos? Did family take care of me when you lied to all these people and told them I was a struggling dropout just so Ebony would look better?" Beatrice flinched, her eyes darting nervously toward the front tables where her friends were hanging on every word. "I am sorry, Kiara," she whispered hastily. "We made mistakes. But you have to save us. You have to save the family legacy." "I will sign the business back over to you," I said, my voice projecting clearly across the ballroom. Clarence let out a massive sigh of relief, and Beatrice immediately brightened, a hopeful smile spreading across her face. "Oh, thank you, Kiara." Beatrice rushed forward, but I held up my hand, stopping her in her tracks. "I will give you the factory back, but only on my terms." I continued, my gaze hardening as I looked at my parents. "You want grace and forgiveness from the daughter you discarded? Then you are going to earn it right here, right now." "What do you want?" Clarence asked, wiping the sweat from his forehead. "Whatever it is, we will do it. First, I want you and Mother to get down on your knees right now in front of all 200 of your elite guests," I said, my voice ringing with absolute authority. "You are going to get on your knees and you are going to apologize to me for every single cruel thing you have ever done. You are going to admit to all your wealthy friends that you were terrible, abusive parents and that I am the one saving you from total ruin." Clarence's face went slack. Beatrice let out a small, horrified gasp, taking a step back. And second, I added, my voice rising even louder. "You are going to publicly acknowledge my son Leo. You are going to tell everyone in this room that he is your true grandson, your first grandchild. You are going to admit that you shunned him because you were too obsessed with your fake country club image to love your own flesh and blood. You will claim him right now in front of everyone, or I keep the factory, and you walk out of here with nothing." The ballroom was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. 200 pairs of eyes shifted from me to Beatrice, waiting to see what the proud matriarch would do. Clarence looked at his wife, his expression desperate. He was willing to do it. He was ready to drop to his knees to save his business. He grabbed Beatrice's arm, pulling her slightly downward, but Beatrice resisted. She stood rigidly, her spine stiff as she looked out at the sea of faces. She looked at the society women whispering at the next table, the women who judged everyone based on their wealth and flawless reputations. She saw the disgust in their eyes. She knew that if she got on her knees and begged the daughter she had outcast, she would never be invited to another charity luncheon or country club mixer again. She looked at Ebony, who was weeping silently, terrified of being exposed further. If Beatrice admitted the truth, if she acknowledged her own cruelty and claimed my son, it would mean admitting her entire life was a lie. It would mean telling high society that Ebony was a fraud, a thief, and a failure. It would destroy the golden child's reputation forever and by extension her own. Beatrice slowly pulled her arm away from Clarence. She shook her head, her face twisted in an ugly mask of stubborn pride and toxic denial. "I cannot," she whispered, her voice trembling with misplaced dignity. "Doing that will make Ebony look like a liar and a thief. It will ruin our reputation. I will not let you humiliate your sister in front of our friends. I will not claim that child and ruin this family." Before I could even respond to her absolute refusal, a loud crashing sound echoed from the back of the room. The massive wooden doors of the ballroom burst open, hitting the walls with a violent bang. The massive wooden doors of the ballroom burst open, hitting the walls with a violent bang that made everyone in the room jump in their seats. The elegant string quartet that had been softly playing in the corner abruptly stopped mid-note, leaving a heavy ringing silence in their wake. Through the grand entrance walked 4 men, wearing dark windbreakers with the bright yellow letters FBI printed boldly across their backs, followed closely by 2 local uniformed police officers. Their heavy tactical boots struck the polished hardwood floor with a terrifying rhythm that completely shattered the refined atmosphere of the anniversary gala. The elite guests of Atlanta's high society parted instantly, creating a wide, clear path down the center aisle, as if parting the Red Sea. Women clutched their pearls, and men stepped back, pulling their wives out of the way. No one dared to breathe. The illusion of the perfect Washington family gathering was now a spectacular public crime scene. The lead agent, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a face carved from stone, did not look at the lavish floral decorations or the crystal chandeliers. His eyes were locked directly on the head table. He marched straight past the gasping guests, past my paralyzed parents, and stopped directly in front of Trent. Trent Sterling, the agent, said, his voice carrying the rough, undeniable authority of federal law enforcement. "We have a warrant for your arrest on multiple counts of wire fraud, bank fraud, and money laundering." Trent looked like all the blood had been siphoned from his body. His expensive, custom-tailored tuxedo suddenly seemed to swallow his shrinking frame. He took a stumbling step backward, bumping into a velvet dining chair, his eyes darting frantically toward the exits like a trapped rat. He opened his mouth to speak, to deploy that smooth-talking charm he had used to con his way through life, but his vocal cords completely failed him. He just let out a pathetic, high-pitched squeak. Beatrice pressed her hands against her chest, her mouth hanging open in sheer terror. Clarence stood frozen beside her, completely incapable of processing that federal agents were arresting his golden son-in-law in the middle of his extravagant anniversary party. The reality of the situation was crashing down on them in real time, and there was absolutely no way to sweep this under the rug. I stood my ground next to Malik, watching the absolute destruction of Trent's fake empire. "You did not think I just stopped at buying the factory debt, did you, Trent?" I asked, my voice slicing through the tense silence of the ballroom. Trent whipped his head to look at me, his eyes wide with rising panic. He was sweating profusely now, a sheer terror completely taking over his features. When Malik and I audited the financials to acquire the factory paper, we found the entire digital trail, I explained calmly, making sure every single person in the room heard exactly how deep the corruption ran. We found the fake invoices, the dummy corporations, and the exact routing numbers you used to funnel my father's retirement money to the Cayman Islands. You were arrogant and sloppy. You left a digital footprint a mile wide because you never thought anyone would actually check your math. Trent began to shake violently, his hands trembling as he looked at the federal agents who were now unhooking their metal handcuffs from their belts. I did not just bring those documents here tonight to show my parents. I continued my gaze entirely merciless as I looked at the man who had stolen from my family. I submitted that entire portfolio to the Financial Crimes Division of the FBI 3 days ago. Every single wire transfer, every forged signature, every stolen dollar has been sitting on an agent's desk, waiting for a federal judge to sign the warrant. You are not just broke, Trent. You are looking at 20 years in a federal penitentiary. The ballroom erupted into a frenzy of shocked gasps. The guests who had spent years envying Trent and Ebony's lavish lifestyle, who had listened to their boasts and attended their country club dinners, were now staring at them like they were diseased. Beatrice let out a muffled sob, finally realizing that no amount of country club posturing could save them from the federal government. Her perfect family was being hauled away in handcuffs while her high society friends watched in disgust. Trent realized the game was entirely over. The walls were closing in, and there was no smooth talking his way out of a federal indictment. The suave, arrogant rainmaker vanished completely, replaced by a terrified, desperate coward, willing to sacrifice absolutely anyone to save his own skin. As the lead FBI agent stepped forward, reaching out to grab his arm, Trent's self-preservation instincts took over in the most pathetic display of cowardice I had ever witnessed in my entire life. "No, wait!" Trent screamed, his voice breaking into a hysterical pitch. He lunged to his right and grabbed Ebony by the shoulders. He forcefully yanked his own wife, pulling her directly in front of him, using her body as a human shield against the advancing federal agents. She knew about it. Trent babbled wildly, cowering behind Ebony's back while maintaining a tight grip on her sequined gown. She signed the transfer papers. You saw the signature on the screen. She is the one who wanted the cars and the country club memberships. She made me do it. I was just trying to make her happy. Arrest her. She is a co-conspirator. Take her instead. Ebony stumbled forward, her designer heels slipping on the polished floor as her husband practically threw her at the police. The absolute shock on her face was almost comical. She had spent her entire adult life defending this man, believing he was her ticket to endless luxury and effortless superiority. She had happily helped him drain our parents' accounts to maintain her illusion of grandeur. And now, at the very first sign of real trouble, the man she had worshipped was offering her up to federal prison just to buy himself a few seconds of freedom. The sheer indignity of being used as a human shield snapped Ebony out of her shocked paralysis. Her perfectly curated socialite persona instantly dissolved, revealing the vicious, selfish core she usually kept hidden beneath layers of expensive makeup and designer labels. Her eyes blazed with feral, furious rage. She let out a piercing, ear-splitting scream that made the nearest guests cover their ears in shock. With a sudden burst of violent adrenaline, Ebony twisted her body and shoved Trent backward with all her might. "Get off me, you broke loser!" Ebony yelled at the top of her lungs, pushing him squarely in the chest. Trent stumbled backward, unable to catch his balance in his expensive leather shoes. He fell directly into the waiting arms of the FBI agents, who immediately spun him around and slammed him face first onto the pristine white tablecloth of the head table. The sound of metal handcuffs clicking into place echoed loudly through the room, sealing his fate forever. Trent thrashed against the pristine white tablecloth, sending crystal champagne flutes and silver centerpieces crashing to the hardwood floor. Two heavily built FBI agents held him down with effortless precision, pressing their weight into his shoulders until he stopped fighting. The sheer violence of the takedown in the middle of a high society gala sent a fresh wave of panic through the room. But the initial shock was quickly replaced by a predatory curiosity. I watched as dozens of wealthy guests reached into their designer purses and tailored suit pockets, pulling out their smartphones. The soft glow of recording screens illuminated the dim ballroom as Atlanta's elite eagerly filmed the destruction of the Washington family to share on their private group chats. They were capturing every pathetic moment, every panicked scream, and every humiliating detail. You have the right to remain silent, the lead agent barked, his voice cutting through the chaotic murmurs of the crowd. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. Trent pressed his cheek against the ruined table, his breathing ragged and shallow. He looked up through his tangled hair, his eyes darting frantically around the room until they locked onto Clarence. My father was backed against the wall, literally and figuratively, his face a mask of complete horror. Trent saw the man who had enabled him, the man who had funded his fake lifestyle and demanded total loyalty. And in that moment, Trent made the only calculation a cornered rat ever makes. He decided he was not going to a federal penitentiary alone. He was going to drag down the man who had built the very pedestal he was falling from. If I am going down, he is going down with me. Trent screamed, his voice tearing through the ballroom with frantic desperation. Do not just arrest me, arrest him. He knew about everything. The FBI agent paused mid-sentence, pressing his knee slightly harder into Trent's back. Who knew about everything? The agent asked, his tone sharp and demanding. Clarence Washington. Trent yelled, pointing a trembling handcuffed finger directly at my father. He knew about the offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. He is the one who told me to set them up. I was just the middleman. He used my dummy corporations to hide his manufacturing revenue. He has been dodging corporate taxes for 10 years and using my accounts to launder the money. A collective gasp ripped through the ballroom. The absolute silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. Beatrice let out a strangled cry, bringing both hands to her face as if trying to physically block out the words. She swayed on her expensive heels, looking like she was about to faint right there on the polished dance floor. Her entire identity, her unblemished reputation was evaporating before her very eyes. Ebony stood frozen near the edge of the stage, her mascara running down her face, completely forgotten in the wake of her husband's ultimate betrayal. The man she had paraded around as the perfect catch was now screaming like a terrified child, selling out her own father to save himself. Clarence looked like he had been struck by lightning. His jaw worked silently, his hands shaking at his sides as he stared at the son-in-law he had chosen over me. The son-in-law he had praised and funded while treating me like garbage. He had always believed Trent was a reflection of his own greatness, a sharp businessman who understood how to play the game. He never realized Trent was just a parasite waiting to turn on his host to save his own skin. He is lying. Clarence finally sputtered, his voice weak and raspy as he looked around at the judgmental faces of his peers. He is a thief and a liar. I have never evaded taxes in my life. I did not know anything about his offshore accounts. I am a victim here. He stole my retirement fund. I have the emails. Trent shrieked, his voice echoing off the high ceilings as the agents pulled his arms back. I have the signed authorizations. He transferred millions of dollars from the factory operating accounts directly into the shell companies to hide his profit margins from the IRS. He told me to do it. He said he was untouchable. Check the hard drives at his office. Check the secondary ledgers. I kept records of everything to protect myself. I have it all documented. I stood next to Malik, watching the absolute carnage unfold with a sense of grim satisfaction. I had known about the tax evasion. When Malik and I audited the factory financials to buy the debt, the discrepancies were glaringly obvious to anyone who knew where to look. Clarence had been bleeding his own company dry for a decade, hiding the money offshore to fund Beatrice's extravagant lifestyle without drawing attention from federal regulators. Trent was just the arrogant idiot who facilitated the transfers, thinking he was outsmarting the government. They were two greedy men, bound by their own corruption, and now they were destroying each other in front of everyone they had ever tried to impress. It was a beautiful, poetic justice that no amount of money could buy. The lead FBI agent hauled Trent up from the table, roughly dragging him to his feet. Trent looked pathetic, his designer tuxedo stained with spilled wine and food, his face red and sweaty. He continued to babble wildly, shouting out account numbers and dates, desperately trying to negotiate a plea deal before he was even out of the building. He promised to give them access to servers and safe deposit boxes, anything to lessen his impending sentence. Two other agents stepped forward, separating themselves from the group holding Trent. They walked with slow, deliberate purpose, their eyes fixed entirely on Clarence. The crowd parted for them once again, pushing further back to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout of the Washington family. The same people who had been eating my father's expensive food and drinking his champagne were now acting like standing too close to him might result in an indictment of their own. They turned their backs on him, whispering judgments and shaking their heads in mock dismay. Clarence backed up until his shoulders hit the decorative wall paneling. There was nowhere left to run. The great patriarch who had ruled our family with an iron fist, who had demanded respect and obedience while offering nothing but conditional love, was completely cornered. He looked at Beatrice for support, but she had already turned her back on him, weeping into the shoulder of a friend who looked entirely eager to leave. He looked at Ebony, but she was staring at the floor, completely disassociated from reality. Finally, he looked at me. He opened his mouth, perhaps to demand that I fix this, perhaps to beg me to use my wealth to hire him a defense attorney. He probably still believed deep down in his twisted narcissistic mind that I owed him my salvation because I was his daughter. But the demand died in his throat when he saw the cold, indifferent expression on my face. I was not his scapegoat anymore. I was simply a spectator to his well-deserved ruin. An agent approached Clarence, stepping directly into his personal space. "Clarence Washington, we need you to come with us for questioning regarding corporate tax evasion." Clarence did not even try to fight or argue his way out of the humiliation. The sheer shock of the moment seemed to drain whatever fight he had left in his body. He simply held out his wrists, like a defeated old man surrendering completely to the reality he could no longer manipulate. The cold metal cuffs clicked loudly against his expensive gold watch, echoing across the silent room. The agents patted him down right in front of the melting ice sculpture that bore his and Beatrice's initials. Camera flashes strobed through the dim lighting as the elite guests of Atlanta's high society eagerly documented the spectacular downfall of the Washington Empire. Clarence was marched toward the exit, his head bowed, his shoulders slumped, looking nothing like the terrifying patriarch who had ruled my life for so many years. Beatrice watched her husband being hauled away by federal agents, and her reaction was not one of grief or wifely concern. The woman who had dictated every aspect of our lives, who had curated the perfect society image with ruthless precision, simply short-circuited. Her brain could not process the shame of her 30th anniversary gala, becoming a high-profile crime scene. Instead of mourning her husband's arrest, she immediately zeroed in on the most pressing threat to her social standing, which was Richard, the club manager, who was still standing near the head table holding the declined credit card slip. The illusion of her wealth was crumbling, and Beatrice completely lost her mind. She spun around, her elaborate updo beginning to unravel, and her expensive gown sweeping across the floor as she marched straight toward me. She completely ignored the fact that less than 10 minutes ago, she had refused to acknowledge my son to save her own pride. "Kiara," she snapped, her voice shrill and echoing with frantic entitlement. "You need to fix this right now. Call your lawyers and pay your father's bail. And give me your black card to settle with the hotel. Richard is waiting, and I will not be embarrassed in front of the mayor and the board of directors. Fix this." I just stared at her, letting the absolute absurdity of her demands wash over me. She was standing in the wreckage of her entire life, her husband and son-in-law on their way to a federal holding facility, and she still thought she could order me around like a disobedient servant. I looked at Richard, who was watching the exchange with professional detachment, and then I looked back at the woman who had made my childhood a living nightmare. "I am not paying for your party, Beatrice," I said, my voice carrying easily over the murmurs of the remaining guests. "And I am certainly not paying my father's bail. You are going to have to settle your own debts tonight." "I do not have time for your petty grudges," Kiara Beatrice hissed, grabbing my arm, her manicured nails digging into my skin. "My husband was just arrested, and my guests are watching. My cards are only declining because the bank made a mistake with a fraud alert. Just give Richard your card, and I will wire you the money on Monday morning from my personal accounts. Do not make me ask you again." I calmly pulled my arm out of her frantic grip. "You do not have any personal accounts, Beatrice," I explained, speaking slowly and clearly so the truth would finally penetrate her delusion. Did you not listen to a single word the FBI agent just said when they threw Trent onto the table? Trent and Clarence were using the corporate accounts to launder money and evade federal taxes. Your personal platinum cards, the ones you use to buy your designer shoes and fund Ebony's endless shopping sprees, are directly tied to that corporate entity. They are funded by stolen money. That is not true, Beatrice gasped, taking a stumbling step backward. I have my own money. I have my own wealth. The bank just made a mistake. When the federal government issues a warrant for financial crimes, they do not just arrest the perpetrators. I continued relentlessly tearing down the last walls of her fantasy world. They freeze the assets, Beatrice. They freeze everything. Every bank account, every stock portfolio, every safety deposit box tied to the Washington name was frozen the moment those agents walked through those ballroom doors. The feds seized the factory assets last week because Clarence defaulted on the loans, and they seized your personal wealth tonight because it is the fruit of a poisonous tree. Beatrice began to physically sway, her hands flying to her throat as she struggled to pull air into her lungs. You do not have a single dime to your name, I said, my voice entirely devoid of sympathy. You cannot pay Richard. You cannot pay a bail bondsman. You cannot even afford an Uber ride back to the mansion because the bank is going to foreclose on that property by the end of the month anyway. You are completely and utterly broke. The society women who had stayed to watch the drama unfold began murmuring among themselves, their voices filled with harsh judgment and vicious delight. Beatrice realized she was standing in a rented ballroom with a $30,000 bill she could not pay, surrounded by people who would never associate with her again. The sheer magnitude of her poverty finally crashed down upon her, destroying the only thing she had ever truly cared about. Ebony had been standing near the ruined head table, staring blankly at the doors where Trent had just been dragged out. The reality of my words finally pierced through her shock. She looked down at her massive diamond rings and her custom gown, realizing that all of it was bought with stolen money. The feds would be coming for her house, her luxury cars, and her jewelry. Her husband was going to federal prison, and her parents were entirely bankrupt. She had absolutely nothing left. She had spent her whole life relying on her pretty face and her mother's manipulations to get ahead, and now the entire foundation had collapsed underneath her. Ebony slowly turned her head to look at Beatrice. The lifelong alliance between the golden child and the narcissistic mother shattered in a single instant. All the years of Beatrice spoiling Ebony and elevating her above me meant absolutely nothing when the money ran out. Ebony let out a guttural sound of pure rage, like a cornered animal realizing its life was over. She stomped across the dance floor, her fists clenched tightly at her sides. She shoved past a stunned waiter and stopped just inches from Beatrice's face. "This is your fault!" Ebony screamed, her voice cracking with hysterical fury as she pointed a trembling finger at our mother. "You forced me to marry him! You forced me to marry him!" Ebony screamed, her voice echoing through the massive ballroom as she pointed a shaking finger right at our mother's face. "I did not even want Trent. He was boring and arrogant, but you just had to have a white Wall Street banker in the family. You practically planned the entire wedding before he even proposed just so you could brag to your stupid friends at the country club." Beatrice gasped, pressing a hand to her chest as if she had been physically struck. "How dare you speak to me that way?" Beatrice shrieked back, her perfectly maintained facade completely shattering into a million pieces. "You greedy little brat! You loved his money just as much as I did. You were the one swiping his platinum cards and flying to Paris every other weekend. Do not act like you were some innocent victim forced down the aisle. You wanted the status just as much as I did. You would not even look at a man unless he had a 7-figure trust fund." Status. Ebony let out a harsh, bitter laugh that sounded almost unhinged. "What status, Mother? We are bankrupt. My husband is on his way to a federal prison, and my father is probably going to share a cell right next to him. You traded my entire future just so you could show off to a bunch of old women who do not even like you. You set me up with a criminal because you were too obsessed with image to care about who he actually was. I could have married someone normal, but you told me I would be a failure if I did not secure a wealthy man. I watched the two of them tear each other apart with absolute fascination. The perfect mother and the golden child were completely destroying each other in front of the exact high society crowd they had spent decades trying to impress. The remaining guests were silent, entirely captivated by the vicious screaming match unfolding in the center of the room. Cell phones were still raised, recording every humiliating second of the Washington family civil war. "You ungrateful little wretch!" Beatrice spat, stepping closer to Ebony, her face red with rage. "I gave you everything. I covered up every single mistake you ever made. Who do you think paid off that clinic in college when you got into trouble? Who do you think bribed the admissions office so you would not get kicked out for cheating? I spent my entire life cleaning up your messes and making sure you looked flawless to the rest of the world. And this is the thanks I get. You are nothing without me and the money I provided." "Well, you do not have any money now, do you?" Ebony screamed right back at her, leaning in close. "You have absolutely nothing. Kiara owns the factory. Kiara owns the debt. You are just a broke old woman wearing a dress you can no longer afford. You are a joke, mother, a complete joke to everyone in this room." Beatrice raised her hand high into the air as if to slap her own daughter, but she caught sight of the glowing screens still pointed in her direction. The elite women at the front tables were recording every single vicious word, exchanging disgusted glances with one another. Beatrice slowly lowered her trembling hand, her face crumpling as the absolute reality of her social destruction finally set in. She turned away from Ebony, looking completely defeated and broken. Her entire world was built on lies, and now those lies were public record. Ebony stood there, chest heaving, as she glared at the woman who had enabled her worst behavior for 30 years. But as the adrenaline of the screaming match began to fade, a new reality washed over Ebony's face. Her eyes darted around the room, taking in the empty champagne glasses, the whispered judgments, and the total absence of her husband. She looked down at her hands, realizing the massive diamond rings on her fingers would probably be seized by the government by tomorrow morning as evidence of fraud. She had no money. She had no husband. Her parents were destitute and facing federal charges. The luxury condo downtown would be confiscated. The sports cars would be repossessed. Her credit cards were likely already frozen by the authorities. She had absolutely no skills, no education she actually earned, and no way to survive in the real world. She could not even afford a taxi ride away from this hotel. Ebony's frantic gaze shifted away from our mother and finally landed on me. She looked at my calm posture and then at Malik, who was standing solidly by my side. She knew we were wealthy. She knew I had just admitted to buying our father's entire multi-million-dollar commercial debt for pennies on the dollar. Her survival instincts kicked in, instantly overriding whatever pride she had left. The vicious anger melted off her face in a matter of seconds, completely replaced by a pathetic, desperate terror. Her knees literally buckled, and she dropped to the polished hardwood floor right in front of me. The expensive fabric of her designer gown pooled around her as she grabbed the hem of my dress, looking up at me with dark mascara-stained tears streaming down her face. "Kiara, please." Ebony begged, her voice completely changing from a furious scream to a pathetic, whimpering cry. "You have to help me. I have nowhere to go. The feds are going to take my house. They are going to take everything. I do not have a bank account in my own name. Trent controlled all the finances. I am completely broke, Kiara. I do not even have money for a hotel tonight." I looked down at the sister who had made my life a living hell. The sister who had mocked my clothes, my job, and my husband. The sister who had smiled smugly when our parents threw me out into the street. Now she was groveling at my feet, begging for scraps from the table of the woman she had always considered beneath her. "Please let me come live with you." Ebony sobbed openly, crying now as she clung to my dress. "Your mansion is huge. You have so many spare bedrooms. I will not be any trouble, I promise. I will stay out of your way. I can help with Leo. I can be a good aunt. Just please do not leave me out here on the street. I have nothing. We are blood, Kiara. We are family. You have to take me in. To take I stared down at her, watching the dark tears run in messy rivers down her cheeks. I let the silence stretch out, allowing her desperate pleas to hang in the air for everyone to hear. The golden child was begging the scapegoat for a roof over her head. I looked at Malik, who gave me a slow, supportive nod, knowing exactly what I was about to do. I slowly reached down and pried her manicured fingers off the fabric of my dress, stepping back, so she was left kneeling alone on the cold floor. "Take you in," I said, my voice perfectly steady and loud enough for the entire room to hear. "Let me remind you of what you said when I had my first miscarriage. Let me remind you of what you said when I had my first miscarriage." Ebony flinched as if I had poured boiling water over her head. The frantic tears streaming down her face suddenly stopped as the memory of her own cruelty hit her. I looked down at her ruined makeup and her trembling lips, refusing to offer even a single ounce of the sympathy she was begging for. 5 years ago, I was lying in a sterile hospital bed, listening to the horrifying silence where my baby's heartbeat was supposed to be. I was completely shattered, entirely consumed by a grief so heavy I could barely pull air into my lungs. The smell of antiseptic was making me sick, and my body was hollowed out by the loss. Clarence and Beatrice did not even bother to show up to the hospital. They sent a generic floral arrangement and a card signed by their assistant because my pain was too inconvenient for their social calendar. But you came, Ebony. You walked into my hospital room wearing a bright pink designer suit and carrying a cup of expensive coffee. You did not bring flowers or a card or even a simple hug. Ebony shook her head frantically, her hands reaching out to grab my skirt again, but I stepped back, putting more cold distance between us. Malik shifted slightly, his tall frame standing like a protective wall between me and my desperate sister. "I thought you were there to comfort me," I continued, my voice echoing clearly in the silent ballroom. "I actually believed that for once in your entire privileged life, you were going to be a real sister to me. I thought you had pushed aside our differences to sit with me in the dark, but you just stood at the foot of my bed and looked at me with absolute disgust. You laughed, Ebony. You actually laughed at my pain while I was weeping into my hospital pillow." "Please, Kiara, do not do this," Ebony whimpered, looking around at the guests who were now staring at her with pure revulsion. "I was young and I was stupid. I did not mean those things." "You were 25 years old," I snapped, refusing to let her minimize her vile behavior. "You leaned over my hospital bed and you told me that the miscarriage was a blessing in disguise. You said I was too poor and too pathetic to raise a child anyway. You told me that Malik was just a mechanic and that bringing a baby into our struggling life would be an embarrassment to the Washington name. And then you looked me dead in the eye and said I was too broken to ever be a mother." A collective murmur of shock and disgust rolled through the crowd. Even the wealthy socialites who thrived on gossip and ruined reputations looked physically sickened by the revelation. Beatrice covered her mouth with her trembling hand, but I could not tell if she was shocked by Ebony's cruelty or just humiliated that her perfect family was being exposed as monsters in front of the mayor and the country club board of directors. "You told me my body was a failure," I said, letting the absolute coldness of my anger freeze the space between us. "You said I was a genetic disappointment and that I should do the world a favor and stop trying to have kids. You stood there glowing with your newly engaged status and mocked a grieving mother who had just lost her child. You broke me that day, Ebony. You took the absolute worst moment of my entire life and you turned it into a sick joke to make yourself feel superior." "I did not mean it," Ebony sobbed violently, wrapping her arms around her own stomach as she rocked back and forth on the ballroom floor. "Trent put those ideas in my head. He told me to be harsh so you would move on quickly. I was just trying to help you move on. I was trying to protect you." "Do not blame Trent for the darkness in your own soul," I said, my tone flat and entirely merciless. "You have always been vicious. You have always enjoyed tearing me down because it was the only way you knew how to build yourself up. You spent your entire life stepping on my neck to get closer to Beatrice and Clarence. You loved being the golden child so much that you sold your soul to keep the title. Well, look exactly where it got you. Your husband is a felon, your parents are bankrupt, and you are kneeling on a dirty floor begging the sister you tortured to save you from the streets. I took another deliberate step back, looking at her ruined designer gown and the pathetic way she clutched at the empty air. My doors will never open for someone who cursed my unborn child, I said, my voice cold as ice. You are not my blood, Ebony. You are just a stranger who happens to share my last name. You made your bed with Trent and Beatrice and now you can lie in it. I am not saving you. I am not taking you in. You are completely and utterly on your own. Ebony let out a haunting wail, burying her face in her hands, as the absolute finality of my rejection crushed whatever hope she had left. There was no more manipulation, no more country club charm, and no more golden child privilege. She was a destitute woman with no future and no family willing to catch her fall. I turned my back on her, feeling an overwhelming sense of peace wash over my soul. The heavy chains of obligation and seeking my family's approval simply dissolved into dust. I looked up at Malik, who was watching me with deep pride and undeniable love. He took my hand, his warm fingers intertwining with mine, grounding me in the reality of the beautiful life we had built together. We had survived their cruelty, and we had emerged entirely victorious. The grand ballroom remained completely silent, except for the sound of Ebony's pathetic sobbing and Beatrice's ragged breathing. The elite guests stood frozen, unsure of how to exit a lavish anniversary party that had turned into a spectacular nightmare. Then the heavy wooden doors at the back of the ballroom swung open once again. Richard, the club manager, marched back into the room, but this time he was not carrying a silver platter or a declined credit card slip. He was flanked by 4 broad-shouldered local security guards dressed in dark tactical uniforms. Their heavy boots thudded against the polished floor as they stepped onto the dance floor, looking entirely unamused. Richard did not offer his usual polite bow or his practiced hospitality smile. His face was a mask of stern professional authority as he stopped near the ruined head table, looking directly at Beatrice and the sobbing Ebony. "Since the FBI froze the accounts, this party is unpaid for," Richard announced, his voice booming through the silent ballroom. "The deposit has been reversed by the federal government and the credit cards on file are entirely invalid. You all need to vacate the premises immediately. You are trespassing." Richard stood tall, his face completely unyielding as he gestured toward the grand exit. The silence in the ballroom shattered completely, replaced by the frantic shuffling of hundreds of wealthy guests rushing to gather their coats and designer bags. Nobody wanted to be caught trespassing by association, especially not when the federal government had just raided the building. Beatrice stared at the club manager, her jaw working uselessly as the reality of her immediate eviction washed over her. She opened her mouth to demand respect, to threaten his job, to leverage the Washington name one last time, but the words simply died in her throat. The Washington name was officially tied to a massive financial crime, and Richard looked like he was ready to physically throw her out into the street himself. The 4 tactical security guards did not wait for Beatrice to find her voice or gather her shattered dignity. 2 of them stepped toward her with rigid authority, while the other 2 flanked Ebony, who was still kneeling on the floor, sobbing into her hands. "You need to leave right now," one of the guards stated, his tone leaving absolutely no room for negotiation or country club privilege. Beatrice yanked her arm away when he tried to gently guide her forward, her eyes blazing with a desperate, humiliated fury. "Do not touch me," Beatrice hissed, smoothing down the front of her ruined evening gown with trembling hands. "I know the way out." But knowing the way out and surviving the walk were 2 entirely different things. As Beatrice took her first step toward the grand double doors, the crowd of Atlanta's elite parted, forming a long, narrow walkway of sheer, unadulterated judgment. These were the women Beatrice had hosted for exclusive afternoon teas, the men she had partnered with for high-profile charity galas, the very society that had worshipped her flawless facade for decades. Now they were staring at her like she was a diseased animal that had wandered into their pristine world. Smartphone cameras were raised high everywhere she looked, capturing every agonizing step of her downfall. Whispers echoed off the crystal chandeliers, slicing through the tense air like physical blades. I heard the word bankrupt, and the phrase federal prison hissed from behind manicured hands and designer suit lapels. The absolute humiliation was suffocating, and there was no place for her to hide. Ebony stumbled behind her mother, practically being held up by the heavy-set guards. She could barely walk in her towering designer heels, her mascara completely blackening her cheeks as her shoulders shook with violent, pathetic sobs. She tried to hide her face behind her trembling hands, but the blinding flashes of cell phone cameras illuminated her misery for everyone to see. The golden child who had spent her entire life looking down on everyone else, who had mocked my struggles and paraded her stolen wealth, was now the ultimate laughingstock of the city. There was no Trent to hide behind, no Clarence to write a massive check, and no Beatrice to bully the crowd into submission. They were completely exposed, and the high society vultures were tearing them apart piece by piece. Malik wrapped his strong arms securely around my waist, pulling me gently against his side as we followed the chaotic procession out of the ballroom. We did not rush our exit. We walked with the slow, measured pace of people who had absolutely nothing to hide and nothing to lose. We were not fleeing a crime scene, we were simply leaving a party that had reached its natural conclusion. As we passed the ruined head table, Richard caught my eye. The stern club manager offered me a slight, respectful nod, a silent acknowledgement that he knew exactly who held the real power now. I nodded back, my head held high and my posture relaxed. The hotel staff did not herd us toward the door or treat us like criminals. They stepped aside, offering polite, deferential smiles as Malik and I exited the ballroom, leaving the destroyed anniversary gala behind us forever. We followed the trail of security guards and humiliated socialites through the sprawling marble lobby of the luxury hotel. Beatrice was marching furiously, her face fixed in a rigid, terrifying mask of denial, while Ebony practically had to be dragged by the elbows, leaving a trail of dramatic sobs echoing off the marble pillars. The heavy glass doors of the grand entrance slid open, revealing a massive, violent rainstorm sweeping across the city. The weather had turned completely feral, mirroring the absolute destruction of the Washington Empire. Lightning flashed across the dark sky, illuminating the panic, and thunder rattled the large glass panes of the hotel lobby, making the fleeing guests jump in terror. The valet station outside was an absolute nightmare of confusion and screaming. Dozens of wealthy guests were shouting for their cars, desperate to escape the scene before the press arrived. Beatrice and Ebony were pushed out from under the protective canvas awning by the sheer volume of fleeing guests who no longer cared about showing them any respect. The cold, torrential rain immediately soaked through Beatrice's expensive silk gown, plastering the heavy fabric to her skin. The elaborate updo she had spent hours perfecting at the salon collapsed entirely into wet, heavy strands that clung to her furious face. Ebony shrieked as the freezing water hit her, trying to shield her designer dress with her bare hands, but it was entirely useless. They were standing out in the pouring rain, completely broke, utterly humiliated, and entirely destroyed. Malik and I stood comfortably beneath the warm, dry awning, waiting patiently for our driver to bring our car around. I watched my mother shiver in the freezing downpour, her perfectly curated life literally washing away into the street gutters. She looked over her shoulder, wiping wet hair from her eyes, and locked her gaze with mine. The absolute venom in her stare was terrifying. She saw me standing there, dry and protected, standing beside a husband who actually loved me, holding the keys to the financial empire she had just lost. The cognitive dissonance was simply too much for her fragile, narcissistic mind to process. She snapped completely. With a sudden feral scream, Beatrice lunged forward, pushing past a fleeing guest. She ripped a heavy black umbrella straight out of the hands of a startled bellhop. Blinded by the rain and consumed by pure, unadulterated rage, she raised the heavy wooden handle high above her head and charged directly at me, aiming to strike me down right there on the wet pavement. Beatrice swung the heavy black umbrella down with all the desperate, frantic strength she had left in her ruined body. I did not even flinch. I did not step back or raise my hands to protect my face because I knew I did not have to. Before the metal tip could come anywhere near me, a strong hand shot out through the freezing rain. Malik moved with a fluid, effortless speed, stepping directly in front of me and catching the thick wooden shaft mid-swing. The impact made a dull, heavy thud, but Malik stood perfectly still, his broad, muscular shoulders shielding me entirely from my mother's unhinged violence. Beatrice gasped, trying to yank the umbrella back, but Malik's grip was like a vice of solid steel. He looked down at the woman who had tormented his wife for years, his expression completely devoid of any respect or fear. With a sharp, effortless twist of his wrist, Malik wrenched the umbrella completely out of her hands. He tossed it casually over his shoulder, sending it clattering across the wet concrete where it rolled into a deep, muddy puddle. Beatrice stumbled backward, her expensive soaked heels slipping on the slick pavement. She looked up at my husband, her chest heaving, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and newly discovered terror. Malik did not raise his voice. He did not need to shout over the torrential downpour and the crashing thunder, because his low, steady tone cut through the storm with lethal precision. "Do not ever raise your hand to my wife again," Malik warned, stepping forward, forcing Beatrice to take another unsteady step back. "If you ever come near Kiara or our son Leo again, I will personally ensure you spend the rest of your miserable life dealing with felony assault charges. You are not a wealthy socialite anymore, Beatrice. You are just a broke, desperate woman who just tried to attack her own daughter in front of a dozen witnesses." My mother looked completely horrified, her gaze darting around the valet station where the remaining guests and hotel staff had stopped dead in their tracks, watching the entire pathetic display. There was no country club manager rushing to her defense. There were no wealthy friends stepping in to protect her honor. The women who had just been drinking her champagne were now pulling their fur coats tightly around their shoulders, turning their heads away to pretend they did not even know her. She was entirely exposed, stripped of every ounce of power she had ever wielded over our family. For decades, she had controlled everyone around her with money and intimidation, and now she had absolutely neither. Right on cue, the sleek black frame of my chauffeured Maybach glided smoothly under the illuminated hotel awning, parting the sea of panicked guests and luxury sedans. The long, elegant vehicle stopped precisely in front of us, its headlights cutting through the dark, rainy night. The uniformed driver immediately stepped out, opening the heavy rear door and holding a massive golf umbrella to keep the freezing rain off my shoulders. Malik placed his warm hand on the small of my back, gently guiding me toward the plush leather interior of the waiting car. I did not look back at Beatrice as I slid into the warm, dry cabin. I did not offer her a parting word of advice or a final gloating insult, because she was no longer worth my breath. She was nothing to me now, just a bitter ghost from a past life I was officially leaving behind forever. Malik climbed in, settling onto the seat beside me, and pulled the heavy door shut, sealing us inside our own quiet, peaceful world. The thick, soundproof glass of the Maybach instantly muted the chaotic storm outside. The contrast was incredibly stark. We were surrounded by the soft glow of ambient lighting and the rich smell of expensive leather, while my mother and sister were drowning in the freezing downpour just a few feet away. Through the dark tinted windows, I watched the absolute tragic finale of my former family. Beatrice and Ebony were left standing entirely alone in the freezing torrential rain. The bellhops were ignoring them, focusing entirely on the paying guests who were still frantically trying to escape the ruined gala. Shivering violently in their ruined designer gowns, the two women suddenly turned on each other once again. Even through the soundproof glass, I could see Ebony's face contorted in vicious rage as she screamed at our mother, pointing her shaking finger directly at Beatrice's chest. Beatrice screamed right back, her arms flailing wildly as the heavy rain plastered her graying hair to her skull and washed away her expensive makeup. They were completely drenched, their expensive silk dresses clinging to their shivering frames like heavy wet rags. They were two miserable, toxic women stranded in an empty parking lot, tearing each other to pieces because they had absolutely no one else left to destroy. They had spent their entire lives treating people like disposable garbage, and now they were the ones being thrown out into the storm. The driver smoothly shifted the car into gear, and the heavy vehicle glided forward, pulling away from the curb. I leaned my head against Malik's strong shoulder, letting out a long, slow breath that carried away the last lingering remnants of my childhood trauma. We drove past the grand entrance, leaving the ruined Washington Empire firmly in the rearview mirror. I felt an overwhelming sense of profound peace settling deep within my soul. I watched the pathetic scene shrink away in the side mirror until the glowing red taillights of the Maybach were the only things piercing the dark, stormy night. 6 months later, the dust had finally settled over the ruins of the Washington family empire, and the destruction was absolute. The universe had delivered its justice with a ruthless and undeniable precision, leaving no stone unturned in their spectacular downfall. Trent was the first to fall completely. The federal government did not care about his charming smile, his custom-tailored suits, or his arrogant Wall Street connections. The judge handed him a 10-year sentence in a federal penitentiary for his role in the massive financial fraud scheme. The man who used to look down his nose at my husband and mock his mechanic uniform was now wearing an ill-fitting orange jumpsuit. He spent his days scrubbing cafeteria trays and sleeping on a thin, lumpy cot surrounded by cold concrete walls. All of his smug arrogance had been violently stripped away, leaving nothing but a convicted felon who would spend the best years of his youth locked inside a cage stripped of his name and reduced to a federal inmate number. Clarence managed to somehow avoid a prison sentence, but the cost of his freedom was complete and utter financial ruin. He was forced to liquidate absolutely everything just to pay off the staggering government restitution and avoid joining his son-in-law behind bars. The luxury cars, the sprawling suburban estate, the offshore accounts, and the designer watch collection, all of it vanished into the hands of federal liquidators. The man who used to dictate terms from the head of massive corporate boardrooms was now working a soul-crushing minimum-wage desk job at a budget car rental agency right near the airport. He spent his days wearing a cheap polyester uniform, apologizing to angry delayed travelers, and taking orders from a regional manager who was half his age. The mighty patriarch of the Washington family had been reduced to a broken, exhausted old man scanning barcodes and enduring daily insults just to afford his basic groceries and a tiny apartment on the wrong side of town. Ebony faced a destruction that was entirely social and deeply personal. She was permanently banned from the country club and officially blacklisted from every single high society event in the city. The wealthy friends she had desperately tried to impress, and the women she had gossiped with, abandoned her overnight, treating her name like a highly contagious disease. Drowning in mounting legal fees and frozen bank accounts, she was forced out of her luxury downtown condo and evicted into a cramped, dingy studio apartment in a terrible neighborhood. The golden child who used to swipe platinum cards and fly to Paris for the weekend was now spending her days recording pathetic videos on her cracked smartphone. She sat in front of a cheap ring light in her tiny kitchen, desperately trying to sell multi-level marketing weight loss shakes and fake wellness teas to her rapidly dwindling Instagram followers. She forced a bright, fake smile for the camera, pretending everything was fine, but the few people who still watched her stories only did so to laugh at her spectacular fall from grace and mock her cheap, unbranded clothes in the comments section. But perhaps the most poetic and devastating justice of all was reserved for Beatrice. My mother, who had spent her entire life judging people based solely on their net worth and openly mocking service workers, was now forced to face the exact reality she despised. Completely bankrupt and desperate for cash to survive, she had taken a job working retail at the exact mid-tier department store she used to walk past and openly ridicule. The woman who once hosted lavish afternoon teas and directed a staff of private caterers was now spending 8 agonizing hours a day standing on her swollen feet, folding discounted sweaters and organizing the clearance racks. She had to wear a plastic name tag and a drab corporate uniform, forced to smile and apologize to the rude, demanding customers who treated her like she was invisible. Every single shift was a grueling masterclass in humiliation. especially when her former socialite friends purposely shopped in her specific department just to watch the great Beatrice Washington ring up their purchases and hand them their receipts. While they were drowning in the severe consequences of their own toxic choices, my life was soaring to heights they could never even comprehend. I stood by the floor to ceiling windows of my brand new corner office, looking out over the sprawling, sunlit Atlanta skyline. My venture capital firm now occupied the entire top floor of a sleek, towering glass building right in the heart of the financial district. I had taken the factory I saved and expanded my portfolio, building a massive, highly respected investment firm that championed underdogs and female entrepreneurs who needed someone to believe in them. The city's elite now answered to me not out of fear or manipulation, but out of genuine respect for the empire Malik and I had built together with our own bare hands. The air in my office smelled of fresh espresso and expensive leather, a quiet, beautiful testament to the absolute peace I had finally achieved. I took a slow sip of my coffee, feeling the warm sunlight streaming through the massive windows and hitting my face. The heavy, suffocating weight of seeking my family's approval was completely gone, entirely replaced by the unshakable confidence of a woman who had saved herself. Malik and I were happier than ever, and Leo was thriving in a home filled with unconditional love and safety. I turned back toward my massive mahogany desk, ready to review the latest acquisition files, and begin my morning when the sleek, modern intercom system on my desk chimed softly. I pressed the silver button, listening as the crisp, professional voice of my receptionist echoed through the quiet, spacious office. "Mom, I am so sorry to interrupt your morning," the receptionist said, her tone laced with hesitant concern and a hint of confusion. "There is a woman named Beatrice here in the main lobby. She is crying hysterically and begging to see you." I stared at the blinking light on my sleek desk phone, letting the receptionist's words sink into the quiet atmosphere of my office. Beatrice was down in the lobby. I slowly moved my hand to the polished silver mouse and clicked open the live security camera feed on my massive monitor. The high-definition screen flickered to life, revealing the expansive marble lobby of my venture capital firm. And there she was. The woman who had spent my entire life telling me I was worthless was standing near the security desk, looking absolutely pathetic. She was wearing a cheap, faded trench coat over her drab retail uniform. Her hair, which used to be styled weekly at the most expensive salons in Atlanta, was now frizzy and carelessly pulled back into a messy knot. Her face was red and swollen as she clutched a crumpled tissue, arguing frantically with the towering security guards who were blocking her path to the elevators. She kept pointing upward, her mouth moving frantically as she demanded to be led upstairs to see her daughter. I zoomed in on the camera feed, watching the desperate, frantic movements of her hands. She looked so small, so incredibly diminished. This was the same woman who used to glide through country clubs, destroying reputations with a single perfectly manicured finger. The woman who had thrown me out into the street without a second thought. Now she was just a broken elderly woman begging for scraps from the daughter she had discarded. She wiped her nose on her sleeve, entirely stripped of the haughty elegance she had worshipped her entire life. There was a time when seeing her like this would have brought me a fierce, burning satisfaction. I would have wanted to go down there and gloat, to look her in the eye and make her feel every ounce of the pain she had inflicted on me. But as I sat in my luxurious corner office looking at the pathetic figure on the screen, I realized I felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no sadness, no lingering need for revenge. The opposite of love is not hate, it is complete and utter indifference. I pressed the intercom button, connecting back to the front desk. "I do not know that woman," I said, my voice perfectly steady and calm. "Have security escort her off the premises immediately, and if she returns, call the police." I released the button, cutting off the connection. I reached forward and smoothly closed my laptop, the soft click echoing in the quiet room. I leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair, looking out over the sprawling city skyline, bathed in the warm afternoon sun. It was finally over. The heavy, suffocating chains of the Washington family were completely broken. I gathered my things and walked out of the towering glass building, leaving the ghosts of my past far behind me forever. The atmosphere transitioned completely as the weekend arrived, bringing a flawless sun-drenched Saturday. The massive iron gates of our sprawling estate stood wide open, welcoming a steady stream of luxury cars onto the long, manicured driveway. It was Leo's second birthday party, and our massive backyard had been transformed into a vibrant, joyful wonderland. Enormous pastel balloon arches framed the lush green lawn, and soft music drifted through the warm summer air. The long tables were covered in white linen and loaded with incredible catered food, while a massive custom-made cake stood at the center of the stone patio. The air smelled of barbecue and sweet flowers. Leo's bright laughter echoed across the lawn as he played with a massive pile of brightly wrapped gifts. But the most beautiful part of the celebration was not the lavish decorations or the expensive catering. It was the people. The yard was entirely filled with genuine laughter and pure, unadulterated love. Malik's relatives were everywhere, bringing a chaotic, wonderful warmth that I had never experienced growing up. His aunts were fussing over the food-loading plates with incredible homemade dishes. His cousins were chasing each other across the grass, playing games and screaming with joy. His parents were holding court by the patio, smiling with deep, authentic pride as they watched their grandson play. My loyal colleagues from the venture capital firm were scattered throughout the crowd, drinking champagne and celebrating alongside us. True friends who had stood by us during our darkest days were relaxing in the shade of the large oak trees. There was not a single drop of toxic blood family present. There were no hushed whispers of judgment, no cruel comparisons, no conditional affection based on status or wealth. Every single person in that sunlit yard was there because they truly loved us and supported the life we had built. I stood near the edge of the stone patio, holding Leo securely on my hip. My beautiful son was giggling happily, his little hands covered in blue frosting from a cupcake his grandmother had sneaked him. He was surrounded by safety by people who would never let him feel inadequate or unwanted. I pressed a soft kiss to his curly hair, breathing in the sweet scent of my child, and thanking the universe that he would never know the coldness of Beatrice or the cruelty of Ebony. I felt a strong familiar presence step up behind me. Malik wrapped his solid warm arms around my waist, pulling me gently against his broad chest. He rested his chin on my shoulder, looking out at the beautiful gathering we had orchestrated. He reached out and wiped a smudge of frosting off Leo's cheek, earning a bright, bubbling laugh from our son. I leaned back against my husband, feeling entirely anchored and protected. "Look at what we built," Malik murmured, his deep voice rumbling against my back. "It is perfect." I looked at the smiling faces of our guests, watching Malik's mother scoop Leo out of my arms to parade him around the yard. I watched my business partners laughing by the pool and my chosen family sharing stories in the warm sunlight. I realized right then that the universe had not just given me a second chance, it had given me a profound truth. True family has absolutely nothing to do with shared DNA or a common last name. True family is not an obligation you are born into. It is about the people who protect you when you are vulnerable, who honor your boundaries, and who celebrate your light without an ounce of jealousy. I turned in Malik's arms, wrapping my hands around his neck and looking up into the dark, loving eyes of the man who had saved me. I had lost a toxic family, but I had gained an empire, a devoted husband, a beautiful son, and a life completely free of shadows. I pressed my lips to his, feeling the warmth of the sun on my skin and the absolute certainty in my soul. We had won. It was a total sweet and permanent victory. The most profound lesson to take away from these experiences is that true family is not determined by shared blood or obligation, but by mutual respect and genuine support. Spending your entire life seeking validation from people who are committed to misunderstanding you will only destroy your spirit. Standing firm against toxic relatives and reclaiming your own worth is the ultimate victory. You do not need the approval of those who actively try to diminish your light, because true independence and self-reliance are your absolute greatest shields against manipulation. Please share your own story of overcoming toxic family dynamics in the comments below and hit subscribe to join our supportive community.